Jeff strolled through the cemetery, taking in the altered scenery on account of the slowly descending sun. This was his domain, and it would always stay that way. He had always been the type to trend towards lonerism. Over the time of his childhood, he became so isolated that eventually, everyone just gave up, his non-immediate family and friends drawing the conclusion that he was in fact dead. This job suited him just fine. The pay wasn't all that much, but he didn't need all that much. His rent was taken care of, he didn't need a car or a phone, and the paycheck completely covered his diet consisting of canned soup and scotch. By the time Jeff arrived back at the small caretaker's shack near the rear entrance of the cemetery, the sun had completely disappeared. He always carried a small torch with him, but it was never really necessary, as he knew every square inch of the cemetery by heart, so he could find his way home in any light. He unlatched the door, no real need to lock it, and walked inside, where he sat on the edge of the small bed. The odd noise from next door came again, barely audible over the whistling of the tea kettle. Standing quickly, he moved the kettle off the stove and listened closely for the sound again. Jeff thought it did, but it was just the wind rattling the windows. He had become more concerned as time passed, as the sound now came in more regular intervals as of late than when it first began. The reason for the sound didn't really bother Jeff. It was more of the curiosity of what was causing the noise in the first place. It was almost like a light knocking combined with a quiet moan. When I first learned of Jeff's predicament, just before I decided to write about it, I nearly scrapped the project, thinking it was just the wind, until I learned about what was really causing the eerie, unexplainable noise. Jeff appeared to be asleep on his bed, but in reality he had both eyes open and trained on the window, watching for any signs of movement outside. He had lain in this state ever since the noise began to occur more and more frequently in the last few hours, and he was scanning the trees for any sign of wind, but he could find none whatsoever. Eventually, he lapsed into unconsciousness, the darkness and quiet sounds calming him into a state of deep sleep. When Jeff finally awoke, the sun was shining briefly in through the window, stinging his reddened eyes and strangling his poor, hungover brain. He rubbed his temples as he sat up, turning away from the window in hopes of finding some relief. There was partial relief, but the light still shone in through the window on the opposite side, slightly dimmed by the large abandoned building that lay just beyond his shack. It had supposedly been abandoned since before the last caretaker left, and seemed quite interesting. Growing up, the rumors had it that it used to be the old funeral home, but of course they could never be fully sustained. The light was a little less harsh as Jeff exited the front door and out onto the neatly manicured lawn of the cemetery. Part of his recovery was stimulated by another glass of scotch, something that was usually a last resort for curing a hangover that always worked every time. He glanced at his watch, and it was lunchtime. Jeff could have gone back inside and made himself a sandwich, but he hadn't done any work all day, so he reluctantly made his way over to the equipment shed for some garbage bags. He opted to do a little tidying in the north section of the cemetery, wandering throughout gravesites and picking up any litter and dead flowers, normal maintenance stuff. He chose this particular section today because it was adjacent to his shack and the large abandoned building. When he was finished, he casually walked alongside the building, pausing every few moments to try and sneak a peek through one of the few windows that lined the outside wall, only to be met with pine boards nailed over them on the inside, preventing any real snooping. Once he reached the front of the building, some of the memories of the noise from last night came back. He could faintly hear a similar sound emanating from the front doors of the building, but there was a new sound that had been added to the mix. A faint, chinkling sound of rattling chains caused Jeff to halt and gaze directly at the doors, where, to his horror, he could make out the chains swaying lightly back and forth, brought on by an unseen force perhaps knocking on the door from within. The garbage bag fell to the ground, unnoticed by Jeff, who was moving in a hypnotic state towards the doors, primal senses on full alert. Jeff stood before the double doors of the abandoned building, trying to spot or hear anything like the previous events of a few minutes ago. The only thing still happening was the chains rattling madly, but that could easily be explained away by the breeze that had mysteriously sprung up when he approached the doors. All throughout the rest of the day, Jeff sat at his small table, drinking tea and smoothing out a plan to perhaps satisfy his curiosity regarding the abandoned building. He finished around sunset and prepared dinner, and once that was ready, he began to wait. For no reason in particular, he rationalized that waiting until 11 p.m. was the logical choice, and again I say, there was no pertinent reason for doing so, he just did. By the time 11 rolled around, despite his best efforts, he was knee-deep in his glass of scotch, thoroughly hammered. I'm speculating here, but I believe that his subconscious already knew what would be in that building, and his sober mind wouldn't be able to handle it alone. I was the first thing that Jeff came across when I finally heard the chains break and the door creaked open slowly. I could see him choking on that blast of stale air that wafted out, and I couldn't blame him. Those doors hadn't been opened for decades, and even I was beginning to hate the smell. When the dust cloud cleared, I could see the light from a small torch play over the surfaces of this echo chamber, and when the light passed over me, it hesitated, and I panicked for a moment, thinking he may have seen me, but just as I tensed up to run, the light continued moving. A scream echoed throughout the north section of Pleasant Valley Cemetery, but it was doubtful that anyone would find it relevant, due to the sparse dotting of homes along the stretch of street that followed the perimeter of the cemetery. I didn't jump at the scream, but did jump as a wooden slam followed seconds after. After all, why would I scream at a scream that I likely caused? The slam, though. I still have nightmares about it, and go into panic attacks whenever anyone slams a wooden door. Looking back, it would be easy enough to explain the doors slamming from an errant gust of wind, but what can't be explained is the rapid chinkling and rattling of chains, as if who or whatever was making that racket locking them back up was determined to keep Jeff locked in that place of soulless self-torture. I decided to write about Jeff because I was worried that someone would come looking for him if they should notice his absence. I don't really care all that much about what really happened. I just think that people may have the idea to search for him and might be able to find him. I wasn't so lucky. I kind of wanted to try and call someone and tell them that Jeff was missing, so at least someone would be temporarily put to work on upkeep and tending to the cemetery. I spent most of my life keeping that place acceptable until Jeff took over, and it kind of hurts to see it in such a state of neglect. But really, what can I actually do? Dead people can't operate equipment, or at least, I can't anyway.